The termination email was still glowing on my laptop screen when Derek slid the papers across our kitchen table. Divorce papers. I stared at the blue backing, at his signature already dried in black ink, and felt the air leave my lungs. "I know the timing seems unfortunate," he said, adjusting his watch like we were discussing dinner plans. "But this has been coming for a while." I looked up at him, this man I'd spent 15 years with, and saw nothing but cold calculation in his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. "I've already spoken to my lawyer. Got everything set up." The casual cruelty of it hit me harder than the actual papers. My hands trembled as I touched the edge of the document. Derek noticed and smiled, that small satisfied smile I used to find charming. "You don't really have leverage anymore," he said softly. "Not without a job." He started listing reasons like he was reading from a script. "My job loss proved I was unstable," he said. "Unreliable. The courts would see that. He'd be seeking favorable terms in the divorce, majority of assets, minimal support obligations. "You always were bad with pressure," he continued, standing to pour himself coffee. "This just confirms it." I sat frozen, watching him move through our kitchen like he owned it. Like I was already gone. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. "I've already moved some money around. Just protecting myself, you understand. Can't have you draining accounts out of spite." The words hung between us. Already moved money. Not after I lost my job yesterday. Already. "How long have you been planning this?" I asked quietly. His pause told me everything. This wasn't a reaction to my job loss. This was something he'd been building toward, waiting for the perfect moment. And he thought yesterday's termination was it. "My name is Vanessa Hartley. I'm 42 years old, and until yesterday, I was a senior project manager at Cornerstone Dynamics. I met Derek when I was 27, a bright-eyed professional who thought his ambition matched mine. We married quickly, built a life in Seattle, bought this house together. Or rather, I bought it while he was finding himself in his 30s. I paid his business school loans when his startup failed. I covered mortgage payments during his 2-year break to write a novel he never finished. I carried us through his lean years, never complaining, always believing we were partners. 15 years of partnership, of what I thought was love. Now he sat across from me, divorce papers between us, acting like I was the liability. But as I stared at those papers, something clicked in my memory. 3 weeks ago. A conference room. My boss's uncomfortable expression. A document I'd signed. The layoff meeting had felt wrong from the start. My supervisor, Patricia, had been oddly formal, almost scripted. "Due to restructuring, we're eliminating your position effective immediately," she'd said, sliding paperwork across the conference table. "However, we value your expertise." That phrase had stuck with me. Value your expertise. There'd been 3 documents. Termination letter. Final paycheck details. And something else, something HR had called a transition agreement. I'd been too shocked to read it carefully, just signed where they'd marked the tabs. Patricia had seemed almost apologetic, but also insistent I sign everything that day. "It's important you secure these terms now," she'd said. I remembered her unusual emphasis on the word secure. Now, sitting in my kitchen with divorce papers in front of me, I realized I needed to find that contract. Derek's confidence grew over the next 2 days. He started acting like the divorce was already finalized, moving through the house like he was mentally dividing assets. "You should probably start looking at apartments," he mentioned casually Tuesday morning. "Something affordable. Given your situation." He stood in the doorway of my home office, leaning against the frame like he owned the space. "My lawyer says if you sign quickly, while you're still emotional, we can avoid a messy court battle. Keep things simple." He pulled out a folder. "A settlement offer. I'm being generous, Vanessa. More than fair considering you'll have no income." I took the papers without reading them. "I need time to think," I said quietly. His jaw tightened. "Don't drag this out. You're not in a position to negotiate." Something in his tone shifted from practiced calm to barely concealed irritation. He wasn't used to me not immediately agreeing. I want my own lawyer, I said. His expression darkened completely. The lawyer's office smelled like leather and old wood. I sat across from Catherine Brennan, a divorce attorney my college roommate had recommended, feeling embarrassed to be there. He filed the day I lost my job, I explained, voice barely steady. Claims I'm unstable, wants favorable terms. Catherine listened, making notes, her expression neutral. I handed her Derek's settlement offer and she scanned it quickly, eyebrows raising. This is aggressive, she said. He's asking for the house, the investment accounts, everything. Then I remembered. Wait, I said, digging through my bag. When I was terminated, there was a contract. A transition something. I found the folder, pulled out the papers I'd barely looked at. Catherine took them, and as she read, her expression changed. She flipped pages, went back to the beginning, read sections twice. Finally, she looked up. Why hasn't your husband asked about this? She asked carefully. Catherine explained the contract slowly, making sure I understood every word. This is a retained consulting clause, she said, pointing to Section 3. Upon termination, you're automatically contracted as an independent consultant for 3 years. She showed me the payment terms. A monthly retainer. Project bonuses. Travel allowances. The total annual compensation is actually higher than your previous salary, she continued. And here's the important part, it's guaranteed income regardless of project availability. Essentially, they're paying you to not work for competitors while keeping you available for critical needs. I stared at the numbers, not quite believing them. Why would they do this? Catherine smiled slightly. Because you know things. Client relationships, proprietary methods, trade secrets. This is cheaper than a non-compete lawsuit and keeps you loyal. She leaned back. Does Derek know about this? I shook my head. I didn't even know. Good, she said. Don't tell him yet. I went home and did exactly what Catherine advised. I stayed quiet. I documented everything Derek said, every text message, every demand. I kept copies of bank statements showing his mysterious transfers. I recorded his calls when he pressured me about signing. But mostly, I stayed calm. Derek mistook my silence for defeat. You're being smart about this, he said Thursday evening, misreading my composed demeanor entirely. I knew you'd see reason. He'd started packing some of his things, assuming he'd be moving into a better place soon. Assuming I'd be the one forced to downsize. I watched him sort through closets, making piles of what he considered his possessions, and said nothing. Catherine had been clear. Let him think he's winning. Let him get confident. The mediation date was set for 3 weeks out. 3 weeks of Derek planning his post-divorce life, spending money he thought he'd keep, making promises to whoever he was secretly seeing. 3 weeks of me staying silent about the contract. The financial gaslighting started on Friday. Derek sat me down with a laptop, pulling up spreadsheets he'd apparently been maintaining. Look at this, he said, pointing to highlighted entries. You spent $2,000 on clothes last year. $1,500 at restaurants. You're careless with money, Vanessa. I looked at the numbers he'd carefully compiled. Every expense of mine documented, while his were mysteriously absent. Where are your expenses? I asked. That's not the point, he snapped. The point is you can't handle finances. The court needs to know that. But I'd learned to keep my own records years ago, when his business investments kept failing. That night, after he went to bed, I pulled up my private files. Every unexplained transfer from our joint account. Every cash withdrawal he couldn't explain. $3,000 to someone named Alexis. $5,000 marked business loan, with no paperwork. The pattern was clear. He wasn't documenting my carelessness. He was projecting his own. Mediation preparation revealed Derek's full strategy. His lawyer sent formal demands. Derek wanted the house, the investment portfolio, both cars, and spousal support. From me. His position is that you're unemployed and will remain underemployed, Catherine explained, reading their brief. He's arguing he needs support while transitioning to a new living situation, and that you'll receive employment assistance through the state. The audacity was breathtaking. 15 years of me carrying us financially, and now he wanted me to pay him. His entire argument hinges on you having no income, Catherine continued. He's told the court you're a terminated employee with poor prospects. She looked at me carefully. The mediation is set for next Tuesday. I think it's time we submitted your updated financial disclosure. I thought about that contract sitting in my drawer, about Derek's smug confidence, about him moving money and planning my downfall. Not yet, I said. Let him walk in thinking he's already won. The first consulting payment hit my account on Monday, exactly as the contract specified. I checked my banking app 3 times to make sure the number was real. $12,000. Monthly. Plus quarterly bonuses. My previous salary had been $7,000 monthly. I sat in my car outside the grocery store, staring at my phone screen, feeling something shift inside me. This was protection. This was leverage. This was proof that everything Derek had been saying was wrong. I'd spent 2 weeks watching him prepare for what he thought would be an easy victory. 2 weeks of his barely concealed excitement about starting fresh, unburdened by what he saw as my failure. 2 weeks of him planning a future where I struggled while he thrived. I transferred the money to my private account, the one I'd opened years ago that he didn't know existed. Then I called Catherine. Submit the disclosure, I said. I want him to see it during mediation. Derek's behavior changed over that weekend. He started staying out late, coming home smelling like perfume and wine. Sunday night, he didn't come home at all. Monday morning, he showed up for clean clothes and coffee, acting like a man already single. Where were you? I asked, not because I cared anymore, but because I was documenting everything. That's none of your business now, he said cheerfully. We're basically separated. He spent freely, charged dinners and hotel rooms to our joint credit card, bought new clothes. He was acting out his new life already, assuming the money would be there. That afternoon, Catherine called. He filed amended paperwork, she said, voice tight with controlled anger. Claims you'll be financially dependent within months, that he needs immediate relief from supporting you. She paused. Vanessa, he's asking the court to freeze your access to joint accounts pending the divorce. Claims you're a financial risk. Derek wanted to cut me off completely. Make me desperate. Force me to accept whatever terms he offered. Catherine's next words were almost a purr. I can't wait for tomorrow. I walked into the mediation office at 9 Tuesday morning wearing my best suit, carrying a leather folder, my expression calm. Derek was already there with his lawyer, both men in expensive suits, both looking confident. Almost bored. Derek barely glanced at me. The mediator, Thomas Crawford, was a gray-haired man with kind eyes who'd seen too many of these meetings. Let's begin with financial disclosures, he said, opening his tablet. Mr. Hartley's financial situation is clearly documented. Derek's lawyer, Pierce Matthews, slid papers across the table. My client earns $90,000 annually, has maintained steady employment, and has been the stable financial presence in this marriage. Pierce continued, Mrs. Hartley, however, was terminated from her position 2 weeks ago. She has no current income, poor prospects in a competitive market, and has demonstrated financial irresponsibility. He placed more papers on the table. Derek's carefully compiled evidence of my spending. The mediator reviewed it all carefully. Then he looked at me. Mrs. Hartley, has your counsel prepared your financial disclosure? Catherine opened her briefcase with deliberate slowness. She pulled out a single document, properly notarized, and slid it across the polished table. My client's updated financial disclosure, she said calmly. Thomas Crawford took it, adjusted his reading glasses, and began scanning the pages. I watched his eyebrows rise. Watched him go back to the first page, then forward again. The room had gone very quiet. Derek leaned over to look at his lawyer's copy. Pierce Matthews was reading with increasing confusion, flipping pages back and forth like the numbers might change. What is this? Derek finally said, his voice higher than normal. Crawford looked up. It appears Mrs. Hartley has a consulting contract with her former employer. Active as of her termination date. That's impossible, Derek said. He grabbed the paper from Pierce's hands. She was fired. She's unemployed. Catherine smiled, the expression sharp and professional. My client was terminated from her employee position and simultaneously retained as an independent consultant. The contract is fully executed and legally binding. Derek's face had gone pale, then red. Catherine walked them through the contract line by line. The 3-year guaranteed term. The monthly retainer of $12,000. The quarterly performance bonuses averaging $15,000. The travel allowances and expense accounts. The total annual compensation, she said clearly, exceeds $160,000. Significantly higher than Mrs. Hartley's previous salary. Pierce was scanning the contract desperately, looking for a way out. This was signed after the marriage began deteriorating, he tried. It could be considered marital property subject to division. It was signed 3 weeks ago, Catherine countered. Before Mr. Hartley filed for divorce. Before he began moving money from joint accounts. She pulled out another document. Bank records show Mr. Hartley initiated asset transfers 4 weeks ago, suggesting premeditation. Derek's mouth opened and closed. His carefully constructed narrative was collapsing. Furthermore, Catherine continued, this contract predates any divorce filing and constitutes Mrs. Hartley's separate income as an independent contractor. Pierce cleared his throat. We need to recess. Consult with my client. Thomas Crawford nodded slowly, his expression neutral but his eyes showing something like satisfaction. The recess lasted 20 minutes. I could hear Derek's raised voice through the conference room wall, Pierce's calmer tones trying to bring him down. When they came back, Derek looked like a different person. The confidence was gone, replaced with barely controlled panic. He asked to speak with me privately. Against Catherine's quiet headshake, I agreed. We stood in the hallway, morning light streaming through tall windows. You hid this from me, he accused, voice shaking with rage. You let me think you had nothing. I looked at him calmly. I didn't hide anything. You never asked. That's bullshit, he hissed. You knew I thought you were unemployed. You let me file papers based on that. You filed papers the day I lost my job, I replied evenly. Before you could know about any transition arrangements. You'd already moved money, already talked to lawyers. You planned this. Derek stepped closer, his expression desperate now instead of angry. This changes everything. We need to renegotiate. Yes, I agreed. It does change everything. He reached for my arm, and I stepped back. We can work this out, he said. Start over. Forget the divorce. I almost laughed. No, Derek. We can't. When we returned to mediation, the dynamic had completely shifted. Pierce withdrew Derek's request for spousal support immediately. Given the updated financial information, he said stiffly, my client no longer seeks support payments. Thomas Crawford made a note. And the asset division? Catherine didn't wait for them to propose anything. My client is willing to accept an equitable division, she said. The house, which she largely paid for during Mr. Hartley's unemployment periods, will remain in her name. Investment accounts will be divided 60-40, reflecting her greater contributions. She continued, Mr. Hartley will retain his vehicle, his personal possessions, and his pension. Mrs. Hartley will retain her vehicle, the house, and her consulting contract as separate property. Pierce looked at Derek, who was staring at the table. That's far less favorable than our original position, Pierce said weakly. Your original position, Catherine replied calmly, was based on fraudulent claims about my client's financial situation. Would you like me to address that further? The threat hung in the air. Pierce shook his head. As financial discovery continued, Catherine produced the evidence I'd been gathering. Every unexplained transfer from our joint account. Every cash withdrawal. The payments to Alexis, who Derek's phone records showed he'd been calling for months. Mr. Hartley withdrew $15,000 from joint accounts over the past 3 months, Catherine stated. He also charged $12,000 to joint credit cards for personal expenses including hotels and dining. Thomas Crawford's expression had shifted from neutral to stern. Mr. Hartley, Did you disclose these transfers in your initial filing? Derek shifted uncomfortably. I was protecting Marshall assets. By spending them? Crawford's voice was sharp now. And by moving them to accounts in only your name? Pierce tried to intervene. My client was securing his position given Mrs. Hartley's impending unemployment, which he somehow knew about before she did. Catherine asked pointedly. The mediator looked at Derek directly. Mr. Hartley, I'm required to warn you that concealing assets or making false claims about spousal finances can result in sanctions. Do you understand? Derek nodded mutely, the fight draining out of him completely. The revised settlement was drafted over the next 2 hours. I kept the house, the one I'd bought with my inheritance when Derek was finding himself. I kept my consulting contract, my retirement accounts, my vehicle. Derek got his pension, his car, and 40% of our investment portfolio. No spousal support. Either direction. Catherine reviewed every line with me while Derek and Pierce sat in another conference room. He's getting less than a third of what he originally demanded, Catherine noted. And he'll likely agree because the alternative is a court battle where all his hidden transfers become public record. She looked at me carefully. Are you comfortable with this? I thought about 15 years of marriage. Of supporting his dreams while mine waited. Of believing we were partners while he planned his exit. Of him filing papers the day I lost my job, thinking I was finally vulnerable. Yes, I said. I'm comfortable. Thomas Crawford brought Derek and Pierce back in. The papers were signed in silence, Derek's pen shaking slightly as he wrote his name. The man who'd filed so confidently 3 weeks ago now signed away his leverage, his plans, his victory. Derek signed the final page without looking at me. His signature was smaller than before, less confident, the pen pressing too hard into the paper. Thomas Crawford witnessed both our signatures, date-stamped the documents, and closed his folder. These terms will be filed with the court, he said formally. Barring any objections within 30 days, your divorce will be finalized. Derek stood up immediately, grabbing his jacket. Pierce tried to say something to him, probably about next steps or procedures, but Derek was already walking out. I watched him go, this man I'd spent 15 years with, disappearing through the conference room door without a backward glance. The man who'd smugly slid divorce papers across our kitchen table was now fleeing the consequences of his own miscalculation. Catherine squeezed my shoulder gently. You okay? I nodded, but my hands were shaking. Relief, anger, grief, vindication. All of it hitting at once. I'd won, but winning felt like surviving, not celebrating. I walked out of that office alone, papers in hand, legally separated from the life I'd built. The truth spread through our social circle within days. Derek had been telling people I'd lost my job and become unstable, that he had no choice but to leave. He'd painted himself as the reluctant hero, making a hard choice for his own well-being. But divorces are public record. Mediation outcomes get discussed. Our mutual friends started asking questions. Carla, my former neighbor, called first. I heard about the settlement, she said carefully. Derek told us you'd be living in an apartment, that he got the house. I explained what actually happened. Word spread. The narrative Derek had carefully constructed collapsed as people realized he'd lied. He'd filed when I lost my job, yes, but not out of concern. Out of opportunity. An opportunity that backfired completely. Through Carla, I learned Derek had moved into a one-bedroom apartment in a cheaper part of town. He'd already sold his luxury car, the one he'd bought 2 months ago expecting to afford it after the divorce. Financial decisions made with confidence in money that was never coming. I moved through the house room by room, reclaiming space Derek had already mentally divided. His office became my consulting workspace. I repainted the bedroom, changed the sheets, bought new everything. Made it mine. The consulting role expanded in ways I hadn't expected. My former employer reached out about a major project, something they needed my specific expertise for. We structured that contract hoping you'd stay engaged, Patricia admitted during a video call. Losing you was the board's biggest concern during restructuring. The project came with a $50,000 bonus. I hired an assistant, invested in equipment, transformed my career from employee to independent professional. 3 months after the mediation, I signed a contract extension with even better terms. What Derek had seen as my failure became the foundation of something stronger. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was building something new, something entirely mine. Something he could never touch or diminish or take away. The woman he'd dismissed as unemployed and unstable was thriving in ways he never anticipated. Through mutual acquaintances, details of Derek's situation trickled back to me. He'd downsized apartments again, moving to a studio in the suburbs. He'd sold his designer furniture, the pieces he'd bought anticipating his fresh start. His confidence had evaporated, replaced with quiet resentment. He'd apparently told friends the settlement was unfair, that I'd somehow tricked him. Convenient how he framed being caught in his own lies as being deceived. Carla mentioned seeing him at a grocery store, looking tired and diminished. He asked about you, she reported. Wanted to know how you were doing. I told him you were consulting, making more money than before. I felt nothing hearing it. No satisfaction, no sympathy. Just emptiness where 15 years of marriage used to be. Then one evening, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Vanessa, it's me, Derek's voice said. I was hoping we could talk. After weeks of silence, now he wanted to talk. About what? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. Just talk. About us. Everything. We met at a coffee shop near the university, neutral territory where neither of us had memories. Derek looked older, tired in a way that wasn't just physical. He ordered black coffee and sat across from me, hands wrapped around the cup. I made mistakes, he started. I know that now. I thought you were vulnerable when you lost your job. I thought it was my chance to get out on favorable terms. At least he was being honest. Finally. I've been thinking, he continued. Maybe we moved too fast. Maybe if we talked more, worked on things. You're clearly doing well now. Better than expected. There it was. The real reason for this meeting. Are you asking me to reconsider the divorce? I said directly. Derek met my eyes. Would you? If we both agreed, we could petition the court. Start over, do this right. I thought about that morning 3 weeks ago. Him sliding papers across the table while my termination email glowed on my laptop. His smile when he said I had no leverage. No, Derek. I wouldn't reconsider. 2 months later, I sat in my home office signing a contract extension. The consulting firm had been acquired by a larger corporation, and they wanted to retain me for 5 more years at an increased rate. The woman Derek thought was powerless had negotiated terms that guaranteed my financial security for the foreseeable future. I'd received the final divorce decree a week earlier. Officially, legally free. My lawyer had called it one of the cleanest outcomes she'd seen, given how aggressively Derek had started. He'd demanded everything and left with scraps, undone by his own assumptions and lies. I didn't win by destroying him. I didn't hire investigators or wage a social media campaign or seek revenge. I won by being prepared, by having documentation, by understanding my own worth when he was certain I had none. Derek had bet everything on my vulnerability, on me being broken by job loss and his abandonment. Instead, I'd protected myself without even knowing it, signing that contract 3 weeks before he'd filed papers. The timing had been purely lucky, but the outcome was justice. I was free, financially secure, and finally building the life I'd always deserved.